Hi, I'm Alison, and welcome back to Part 2 of Lesson 2, Understanding Business Strategy, Needs and Constraints. So, you've uncovered a mountain of needs. What do you do now? If you recall, in Part 1 of this lesson, we identified a large number of both current and future development needs. Your next step in this lesson would be to identify your organization's existing critical learning gaps. Learning gaps refer to the development needs that are not addressed by an existing solution or intervention. You can discover these gaps by comparing them against the learning audit that you did in Lesson 1, Post-Lesson Activity B. Any KSA and corresponding target employee group not served by an existing solution identified in your learning audit would be a learning gap. On this slide, you'll see a helpful way to organize the learning gaps that you have uncovered. Following the what, who, and why framework, you can easily see what current and future development gaps still need to be addressed. For example, you can see that a current learning gap that exists in the organization is asynchronous communication amongst customer success employees. And this is because the team will be moving to remote and has to juggle between different time zones. You can also easily see that a future learning gap that exists is data literacy for the product and marketing teams. This is because they need it to drive the digitalization strategy forward. Once you've identified and organized your learning gaps, your second step would be to prioritize the most important and impactful ones. You'll have to activate your power team for this one. Let's take the example of current needs from the slide. During prioritization discussions with your power team, you all agreed that upskilling asynchronous communication for customer success employees is of medium priority because the team's only going to go remote in Q3 next year. Whereas you've identified that people leadership skills for first-time leaders in engineering is of top priority because turnover is just too high right now and it's extraordinarily difficult to hire great engineering talent. As you can see, a prioritization discussion is rarely about what needs to be developed, but what needs to be developed now because it is the most important and impactful. Check out Post-Lesson Activity B, Critical Gap in Prioritization Analysis, where we've provided a step-by-step guide to support you to do exactly this, to facilitate a prioritization exercise with your key stakeholders. Before we move on, I thought it would be important to touch on competencies as they're often used in L&D strategies together with or as a replacement for KSAs. If you're in L&D, you would most definitely have either heard about, used, or gotten frustrated with the idea of competencies. There are many varied definitions on what a competency is. The definition I like is that it's a cluster of related KSAs that give rise to the behaviors needed to perform a given job effectively. For example, the competency aligning performance for success, taken from the Harvard Competency Dictionary, consists of several KSAs, such as sets performance goals, creates a learning environment, and collaboratively establishes development plans. Competencies can be really useful in your future-oriented L&D strategy. Having a set of core competencies for leadership or the organization will provide a big picture view of the KSAs needed for the success of the organization. Core competencies also provide a benchmark which enables employees to self-assess their learning needs and drive their own development. How then can you include competencies in your L&D strategy? Due to the time investment that goes into building competencies, I would suggest developing them for groups of employees or business areas that are more stable, such as leadership, or to create generalizable competencies for the organization, such as competencies that will drive culture and values. If your organization has the time and resources to invest in building up competencies, it might be worth hiring an expert to work with you to do this, as competency building is a complex process that requires specific methodology. Due to the time investment, I would suggest developing them for groups of employees or business areas that are more stable, such as leadership Or create generalizable competencies for the organization, such as competencies that will drive culture and values. If you're strapped on time and resources, or your organization is in the midst of hypergrowth, I would suggest ignoring competencies for now. And just focus on the most critical KSAs for the most mission-critical groups of people. You can always come back to competencies when things have stabilized a little. Alright, it's action time again. This time, your mission is to facilitate a prioritization exercise with your power team. The goal of the prioritization exercise would be to align your key stakeholders on the learning priorities for the organization. The exercise will also create space for your key stakeholders to have important discussions around the organization's learning needs. As you can imagine, stakeholders across the business areas will have very different ideas on what the key learning priorities should be. Therefore, a great way to align different opinions and get stakeholder buy-in is to facilitate a discussion amongst all of them. At the very end of the prioritization exercise, you'll have a clear idea of what needs to be developed by who and when should it be developed by. Now that you've got your learning priorities clear, it's time to take resources and constraints into account. Generally speaking, you would want to consider these three big factors. The first being the maturity of the organization towards development initiatives. We don't often talk about this factor. However, whether leadership approves a learning intervention or whether employees are willing to learn and apply their learning back at work is affected by how much they trust the learning intervention. And trust is impacted by past experiences of learning initiatives. For example, if the organization has only ever run feedback trainings, that's probably not the best idea to bring in a group coach for the leadership team to talk about their internal power struggles, conflicts, and competition. This might take the team so far outside of their comfort zone that they reject all the learnings. You might instead want to start with a team chartering workshop that introduces new but still easily accepted ideas, such as building more effective group norms. The next factor is the one we all automatically consider. How do we best balance cost versus impact? We find that the prioritization exercise done beforehand provides a lot of useful information here. Consider spending more on mission-critical KSAs or employee groups, and less on lower priority and therefore lower impact initiatives. Finally, time constraints. Remember that this is not only related to how much time your team has to run these development initiatives, but also how much time do the employees have to spend on learning. Remember that mission-critical employee groups are often the ones with the least time to spend on development. Now, let's take a break from hypotheticals and hear from experts Lavinia Mahedintu, Elaine Bejani, and Aki Friedrich on what they consider when developing an L&D budget. As a little bonus, you'll also get to hear Elaine Bejani walk you through the 4 steps to defining your L&D budget.
As far as I know, there are 3 types of L&D budgets: centralized, decentralized, and the combination of both. Putting together a centralized budget, meaning one you fully control as an L&D, usually starts with the needs assessment. Here, I would recommend you to understand beforehand how different learning methods can help you reach your goals. Once you've defined your solutions in terms of learning methods and topics, you have to look for those that need a budget and then prioritize. Excel skills come in handy during this process. If your budget is decentralized, that means you give people what is called a learning stipend, a monthly or annual budget they can spend on whatever they need. If you have a combination of both these types of budgets, you need to figure out which programs might have a wider target audience, like leadership development, talent development, or new hires. First, decide on these ones and build your centralized budget. Then, see what budget you can use for learning stipends for people to use freely, depending on their needs.
So let's talk about budget. And I would like to start with the learning that I had myself some time ago. And that is that initially I thought a lot about how to control a budget, how to monitor a budget. And nowadays I rarely do. I think much more about how to activate people to use the budget and how to support them to use it in a helpful way. Keeping that in mind, I would suggest three things. Number one, make the budget really easily accessible. If someone in the organization is interested in something or passionate about something and they want to learn about it, make it really easy for them to use the budget. You don't want to miss out on a chance for someone to do that because perhaps the process is too complicated. Number two, promote your budget. An L&D budget is a super important part of a modern organization, and you should promote it inside and outside the organization. Let people know that there is a budget and let them know how to use it. And last but not least, inspire people what to use the budget for. So you can either recommend high quality resources or you make people share what they use the budget for so others can get inspired by that. And that's my take on budget.
When you think about what's important to consider when developing an L&D budget, you need to look at what are the critical business needs that you will address and what investment will help you make a quick and impactful impact. So for example, will you need to invest in learning technology, in external consultants, in content development? Also, you need to think about what investments will help you build impactful learning experiences. We all know that the way learners experience learning impacts the effectiveness and the results as well. And another thing that you can consider is what investments will help you better measure the impact of your learning initiatives. But if you want your budget to be approved, you will need to have a strong case and to be able to demonstrate the return on investment. So you need to be able to gather a lot of real-time data. How are your learning solutions helping your employees perform better? How they are helping drive the business results? So you will know as you develop budgets, that budgets are an iterative process. It just doesn't happen at once. You don't get asked to develop a budget and it's approved. It's not usually how it goes. So we need to consider different things when you develop a budget. First step is for you to go back and define your business needs, the business needs that you are addressing through learning. And what are the solutions that you are considering to address these needs? Once this is clear, you move to step two. You start looking at what types of technology, for example, you will need to help you accelerate the learning. For example, will you need a learning management system or a learning experience platform? Will you need to invest in authoring tool to create content? Will you need to invest in a coaching platform? So think about the technology that will help you enable the learning. Now, the step that follows, step three, would be to look at the people you will need to partner with to develop your learning solutions and to deploy them. For example, this could be instructional designers that you will work with to develop content internally. It could be external trainers that will come in and facilitate training programs. And then the last step is to look at internal resources that you have so that you have alternative options as well in case you don't get all the budget approved. For example, you can look at having a pool of internal trainers who can facilitate training internally. So you will need to invest in like one session, let's say, of a train the trainer to get them familiar with the program and help them succeed. Or it could be looking at internal coaches inside the company that will help you within programs or mentors. So looking at all the alternatives that you have inside the company and things you can do in case your budget doesn't get approved.
Congratulations! That brings you to the end of Lesson 2. Here is a gentle reminder to complete post-lesson activity A and B. If you're not yet at the stage of wanting to take action with your stakeholders, we would recommend at least still reading the guides, as they'll provide more detail on how you'd go about doing a needs analysis or a prioritization exercise back at work. When your post-lesson activities are done, we'll see you in Lesson 3, creating L&D goals and metrics. In Lesson 3, we'll work on creating goals and metrics to measure results for the very L&D priorities that you've just identified.